There are a lot of different aeons in the universe of Honkai Star Rail. Some of them exemplify noble beliefs such as order or erudition, while others may have slightly more straightforward ones like preservation or destruction. Because these beings are larger than life and are functionally viewed as gods to most people, it's natural they would have followers who wish to act like they do. Followers of preservation wish to protect other people, and those that follow destruction want to destroy everything. It's pretty straightforward. However, there are a few factions that are rather unusual, whether it be the way they interpret their Eon's wishes or their circumstances. So in this video, I want to share with you 5 factions that I feel are the most unusual of the bunch. Before we explore that any further, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Unusual or weird is a subjective term. To some of you, it might mean when things are out of the ordinary. To others, it might mean something doesn't follow the norm. So for the purposes of this video, unusual just means they might not conform to what the path and aeon stand for and might even be contradictory to those ideals. It'll also apply to those factions who are just in unusual circumstances. This will make sense once you hear about some of them later. Also, this isn't in any particular order. Let's start off with one of the followers of Ix, the Aeon of Nihility. Yes, that's how I'll be pronouncing its name. The Aeon of Nihility is depression and apathy made manifest. While Nanook thinks that existence is a mistake, Ix views it as entirely meaningless. The distinction here is that Nanook seeks to correct this mistake by destroying everything, but Ix is just apathetic to all of existence. If the universe is meaningless, one should just not partake in it, since eventually it will end on its own. Everything you do is inconsequential, since when it ends, all your goals and achievements would be basically meaningless. Followers of Ix believe in pretty much the same thing, and those who have met the Aeon often fall into a deep melancholy as they realize their existence means absolutely nothing. I mean, if you met the literal embodiment of nothingness, who can really blame you for developing such feelings? There is one faction, however, who follows Ix, and I use that term loosely because for some odd reason, they have developed completely opposite feelings to apathy. While most would fall into a pit of despair, those from the Doctors of Chaos view Ix differently. After witnessing Ix in all its majesty, this group has decided that instead of feeling all dejected and accepting reality for what it is, they have instead taken it upon themselves to change Ix's mind. Their goal is to resist nihility itself and try to prove to the Aeon that there is meaning behind existence. Let that sink in. They want to explain to the god of not caring that it should care just a little bit. Their very goal is a paradox and not something a normal person would even think could be accomplished. And yet, with their bottomless source of protagonist optimism, this is what the Doctors of Chaos have set out to do. Upon gazing on the visage of the Aeon, for some weird reason, they instead become inspired and convinced that the universe indeed has meaning. And the best way to prove that is by changing the mind of the spokesperson of Nihility itself. Even Herta, a member of the Genius Society, told the main character to avoid Ix outright in the simulated universe, as she thought it would be impossible to not fall into outright despair, which makes this particular group very unusual given they are able to resist the effects of nihility. Moving on to the next group on this list, we have a faction related to Mythus, the Aeon of the Enigmata. Now Mythus, unlike Ix, does actually involve itself with the universe. While Ix couldn't be bothered, Mythus actually wants to help the inhabitants of this reality. You see, Mythus believes that the universe is a complicated and difficult thing to understand, and humanity's attempt to unravel its mysteries are dangerous not only to itself, but to other living creatures as well. So in order to save them from themselves, Mythus's goal is to obscure as much knowledge as possible, so that nobody can endanger others in the pursuit of understanding the universe. I do want to point out, however, that its intentions aren't entirely noble, as it also thinks that people are just too stupid to figure it out. Alongside Mythus are two factions that follow its lead, the history fictionologists and the riddlers. For the purposes of this video, we'll be talking about that second group. While the first group obscures knowledge by altering facts or historical events, the riddlers are doing it in a very self-destructive way. You see, their approach is to essentially change the meaning behind language and linguistics itself, so that a word, a sentence, or even context for something can carry different meanings to different people. They do this thinking that the more confusion exists, the more limited the dissemination of knowledge becomes. It makes sense on paper, except that what happens if it reaches a point where even they can't communicate with each other? If every other word can mean 1,000 different things, I would imagine it would impede even their own mission. At least with the history fictionologists, the knowledge they obscure still exists in some form, but the Riddlers are just doing something that will eventually screw them over as well. I suppose Mythus would still ultimately know the truth about everything, but given language is a largely made up thing, going down this path would ultimately result in just overall confusion, even for them. It's possible that if it ever reaches this point of no return, they might consider their work done, but it still doesn't solve what they do after. Perhaps they just aren't thinking that far. Next on the list, we have the Morning Actors. Now, the Morning Actors are a faction under the Aeon of Elation, aha, and for all intents and purposes, they're pretty normal. So if that's the case, why are they here on this list then? What's weird here is not really the individuals or their beliefs, but more the circumstances of this particular faction. You see, aha has only one goal: to have fun and generate as much laughter from that fun as possible. Aha's true followers, or rather the ones closest to its ideals, are the masked fools, who also pursue fun as their utmost priority. The morning actors, on the other hand, do not actually pursue elation. In fact, they think it's dangerous and a purely wasteful belief to have, as elation distracts you from things that truly matter. The morning actors even go around the galaxy informing others on the dangers of overindulging into elation. For all intents and purposes, they technically oppose elation and its aeon, and this is what makes their circumstances rather unusual. Because, despite going against AHA and actively trying to diminish its influence, in reality, they are actually blessed by AHA itself. Can you guess the reason why? It's simply because AHA thought it would be funny to watch a group that despise him so much struggle with the fact that they have powers granted by the very thing they hate. The more they oppose him, the more he blesses them, as the whole thing is just hilarious to him. What I shudder to imagine is what would happen to them should AHA ever get bored, but I guess we'll just find that out later in the story. The fourth entry on this list is one of the factions that follow the Remembrance. Officially, there is really only one main faction that follows the Aeon of Remembrance, the Garden of Recollection. They function pretty much the same as their Aeon, collecting the memories of important events in an attempt to assist their Aeon in its grand work. But they aren't the faction we'll be talking about. The group that seems out of place and the fourth entry is actually a sub-faction of the Garden of Recollection, the cremators. The cremators are a secretive group who believe functionally the same as their other brethren. The difference here is that they feel certain memories are not worth keeping, as they judge them to be insignificant or unimportant. Because of this, they would often secretly steal light cones or memories in the possession of the garden to be destroyed, so no trace of them exists. In a way, they seem to function more like followers of Mythus, though if you should ever meet one, they would likely vehemently argue that they are doing this for the benefit of Fuli. They make the assumption that the God of Remembrance itself can't fully carry the burden of all these memories, and it falls on them to lighten this burden. If you know anything about Fuli though and why it does what it does, then you'll know that this is something completely false. The hubris of thinking you know better than the god you are following is palpable to say the least. So while the cremators do help in the activities of the garden, as most of them are memo keepers, they are also the ones actively going against its goals. It's functionally taking one step forward and another step back, though since Fuli doesn't reprimand them, I suppose it's not a really big deal. Finally, last on this list are followers of Terminus, the Aeon of Finality. Not much is really known about this particular Aeon, though due to the nature of its path, it's rumored to exist at the very end of time. Terminus is said to be traveling through time as it aims to bring about a very specific end, likely one tied to its very existence. Because of this, its presence isn't particularly felt by the larger universe, as it just travels through time and space murmuring things about what might happen. The faction that we're going to talk about related to Terminus are the Omen Vanguards. Let's say for a moment, you were flying through space on your spaceship and you happen upon Terminus zipping through the void of space near you. You obviously take a look at it and perhaps you notice it's mumbling to itself some incoherent and likely incomprehensible sentences. It largely ignores you though, and as inexplicably as it appeared, it then disappears. What would be your first thoughts having experienced this? Maybe you'd say, whoa, that was an eon. Or maybe you'd go, wow, that was unexpected. What was happening? Or perhaps you would just shrug it off and continue on with your journey. If you would have reacted in any of those ways, then you're a pretty normal person. The Omen Vanguard, however, would say otherwise. You see, when they witnessed this, the first thing that popped into their mind was, oh my god, that Eon is telling us about the future. And this is where the unusual approach to finality comes in. The Omen Vanguards are focused on one thing: recording all of Terminus's ramblings and figuring out if they are prophecies. Now, on the surface of it, this seems rather silly. How could you possibly think that the ramblings of a random cosmic being could possibly be related to the future? That is until you recall Elio's abilities and his so-called affiliations with this particular Eon. Now, it could be that Elio has a different ability altogether and might not even be related to Terminus specifically, but it's still possible that Terminus somewhat knows the future given its true body resides at the end of time. A caveat though is that given that it's trying to materialize a very specific future and not all futures, whatever his ramblings are might just be related to that specific future alone. So the Omen Vanguard are either wrong in a big way or may turn out to be correct but ultimately have the universe end anyways, since that's the future Terminus resides in. As too little has been revealed about them thus far, we might only get the details of this later on in the story. With that, we've covered some of the more unusual factions that exist in Honkai Star Rail, as some of them contradict their paths and eons overall, and the others seem to be doing things that don't make sense at all. Given that this is based on information we have right now, the lore on some of these factions may change as we move forward into the story. Who knows, as we learn more about the family in Penacony or the Abundance through Jingliu's plan, they might eventually qualify for this list as well. Let me know in the comments which factions you think should be included on this list. Are there any other weirdos that I might have missed? If you enjoyed watching the video, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.